Hey guys, tonight we're not chasing kings or great battles. We're stepping into quieter places, a freezing hut on a medieval night, the dangerous court of Anne Boleyn, the harbour of Boston filled with floating tea, and a forgotten city in the Peruvian desert. This is boring history for sleep, where stories unfold slowly, told by a sleepy historian, not to excite you, but to ease you into rest. Over the next 2 hours, we'll move from survival in the cold to love and downfall in a royal court, to defiance across an ocean, and finally to a civilization built on peace instead of war. If these long, sleepy journeys are the kind of history you'd like to return to, you can subscribe to Historian Sleepy 365. It helps keep this quiet space alive. So now let the lights go out. Settle into your bed, breathe slowly, and let the weight of the day drift away. The past is waiting, and I'll tell you the story. Imagine you're living through a winter in the 14th century, not in a stone castle or on the bustling streets of a city, but in a small village where your home is nothing more than a hut made of mud and straw. Outside, the wind howls across the barren fields, carrying with it a chill that slips through the cracks in the thatched roof. Inside, you sit curled up near the fire, watching the red embers flicker against patchy walls, knowing full well this house won't keep you warm through the night. Peasant homes in that time were built from whatever was cheapest and most available. Wooden stakes formed the frame. Thin branches were woven into a wall, then coated in mud mixed with straw, a method known as wattle and daub. In summer, these walls were bearable, but winter was different. The mud cracked, the straw rotted, gaps opened up, and every gust of wind found its way in. The roof, packed with thatch, looked thick, but all it took was a long, soaking rain. The thatch would absorb water, freeze, and become colder than the air itself. You could be lying indoors and still hear the wind whistling, as if it were blowing right beside your ear. The floor wasn't made of brick or wood, just packed earth. People often scattered straw to sleep on, but it grew damp, musty, and never lasted long. The soil underneath always stayed wet. Its cold crept into your body through the thinnest layers of flesh. The moment you lay down, your back and hips would begin to ache from the cold. People tossed and turned through the night, trying to find a less frozen patch. But the truth was, the entire house was one hidden slab of ice. In the dark, things became clearer. You could hear the wind scraping across the roof, the wooden beams creaking, insects rustling somewhere in the straw. If your house was near the livestock shed, the lowing of cattle and the clucking of chickens would echo into the night, tangled with the wind. Sometimes a rat would dart across your sleeping spot, its tiny scurry just loud enough to jolt you awake. There were no window panes to block it, no insulation to separate inside from out. The house was like a thin box, with only a brittle layer of mud in between. Light was rare. There was no electricity, no bulbs. The only glow came from the fire, or a few oil lamps made from animal fat. They cast a faint, yellow light, flickering just enough to reveal the haze of smoke floating in the air. When the fire flared up, darkness retreated. The room lit up slightly. But when the flames died down, everything sank back into blackness. Only the red embers remained, glowing like tiny eyes in the night. In that dim glow, people could often see their own breath. Each exhale turned to mist, lifting into the air and fading. Winter nights turned breath into proof of life. People breathed shallowly, softly, trying to keep the cold from reaching too deep into the lungs. A deep breath meant dragging the frost all the way inside your chest. And so breath became a soft rhythm in the night, a quiet chorus shared by the whole family. If you listened, you could hear them all: the sigh of someone turning over, the soft cough of a child with a cold. It wasn't peaceful sleep. It was a string of half-wakings, half-dreams, stitched together through the long night. In homes like this, entire families often slept together. A bed wasn't a bed in the modern sense, just a patch of ground with straw, or a rough plank covered in thick, stiff wool blankets. Parents, children, even grandparents, all squeezed into a narrow space. The warmth of bodies piled together helped them survive, but it brought smells too: the odor of sweat, of mildew, of damp straw. Many families even brought animals indoors: dogs, cats, chickens, sometimes a calf, to keep them safe and to share the heat. The air inside became thick with the scent of fur, wet straw, and livestock droppings. On certain nights, the fire was the only hope, but fire was dangerous too. There was no chimney to carry the smoke away. It had to drift through cracks in the roof or door. The house, as a result, was always choked with smoke. Eyes burned, throats scratched, lungs ached. But without fire, you'd freeze. People had to learn how to keep the fire through the night, burying glowing embers under a layer of ash so they could be stirred back to life at dawn. If the fire died completely, someone would have to get up in the middle of the night, step out into the freezing dark, find wood, and start from nothing. In that kind of cold, it was no small task. When night fell, time stretched in strange ways. People went to bed early, not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. But sleep didn't come all at once. It arrived in two parts: the first sleep and the second sleep. Between them was a long waking period, sometimes an hour or two. During that time, you might talk quietly to the person beside you, tend to the fire, or simply lie still, listening to the wind, waiting for sleep to return. Darkness made every sound louder. A single cough echoed like a drum. The wind's whistle could sound like a ghost's cry. And in that wakeful space, many prayed, hoping to make it through the night. What you ate before sleep mattered too. It was known that an empty stomach would make you cold faster. So before bed, families would eat something dense with energy: barley porridge, bean soup, or, on rare days, a chunk of fatty meat. That food gave off inner heat, buying a few more hours of warmth. But not everyone had food. In many winters, supplies ran out early, and cold paired with hunger made the night stretch even longer. The feeling of winter wasn't just cold, it was the smell of damp clinging to your clothes. People didn't have many garments. They wore layers, not for style, but for warmth. Heavy wool cloaks full of patches, stiff and dirty. Washing clothes in winter was nearly impossible. Water froze, and even if you washed something, it wouldn't dry. So the fabric grew thicker with dust, sweat, and smoke. You went to bed in the same clothes, hoping they would trap some heat, even if it meant itching and discomfort. There were nights so cold you no longer felt human, only a lump of damp wood, heavy and still. You curled into yourself, knees drawn in, trying to shrink your body, to hold on to whatever warmth remained. Beside you, your family did the same. The whole household became a single tangle of shapes, breathing pale mist, waiting for the dawn. And some mornings, there would be one less breath: the elderly, the very young, the weak. Not all made it through. Winter death didn't arrive loudly. It came silently, like the final breath fading into cold air. In that world, surviving the night was already a miracle. Peasants didn't dream big. They just hoped the fire wouldn't die, their bellies wouldn't be empty, and the whole family would wake up together when morning came. A medieval winter night wasn't a postcard of falling snow, it was a test, a brutal, recurring test, year after year. When you think of winter cold, you might picture sharp winds stinging your skin, or snowflakes drifting down onto rooftops. But for a medieval peasant, the deepest cold didn't just come from the sky or slip in through the door. It came from the ground beneath their feet. Their wattle and daub homes had no tiled floors, no wooden boards. Every part of life played out on a packed earthen floor, where moisture and frost constantly rose upward, seeping into the body, little by little. They called it the floor, but it was just firmed down dirt, sometimes tamped with stones, sometimes mixed with straw, to strengthen it. In summer, it was dry, dusty, and hot. But in winter, it became a mirror of cold, a surface that pulled heat away. Imagine pressing your bare hand against a stone on a cold night. In seconds, your warmth is gone. The medieval peasant's whole body endured that same touch, not for seconds, but for the entire night. To fight it, they spread straw or dried grass across the floor, but straw was never a perfect insulator. When fresh, it was springy, comforting, but after a few nights under the weight of bodies, it flattened. Moisture crept in from the earth, the straw soured, grew moldy, and began to smell faintly sour and damp. People had to replace it often, but in winter, dry grass wasn't always available. So many families slept on matted straw, where the damp soaked through, leaving ribbons of cold across their backs, shoulders, and heels. Lying on an earthen floor in winter was an experience you didn't forget. The cold didn't strike, it crept. At first, it was a slight chill, easily ignored with an extra blanket. But soon the back began to numb. Then the hips. Then the shoulders. Then the knees. Each joint stiffened, as if you were slowly turning to stone. There was no gust, no sudden bite. Just a patient, silent cold. It didn't scream, it didn't surprise, it simply wore you down. Some said sleeping on cold earth felt like lying on a slab of ice. It drained your strength slowly. Sleep came in fragments. You curled, shifted, pulled the blanket tight. But no matter how you turned, the cold found its way. It didn't stop at your back. It crawled up the spine, down to your feet, out to your fingertips. Every time you stretched, the cold found a new edge to sting, and you curled back in. To fight it, some families used animal hides or coarse wool rugs, but those were rare and costly. Most peasants had only a few heavy, stiff blankets. They slept piled on one another, sharing body heat. In that world, human warmth was the most vital insulation. People became each other's blankets, not fabric, but flesh. The cold from the ground drew them together, despite the smells, despite the cramped space. But not everyone could survive so easily. Children felt the cold fastest. Their small bodies couldn't hold warmth long, and the chill from the ground crept upward quickly. Mothers often held them close to the chest, using their own bodies as shields. Sometimes a father would lay the child across his belly, letting the warmth radiate outward. But if the night dragged on and the embers dimmed too soon, sometimes by morning, a child had stopped breathing. Stories like that weren't rare, and they were often accepted as just another part of winter. The elderly were vulnerable too. Joints already sore became even stiffer. Cold tightened blood vessels, weakened heartbeats. Old bodies laid on bare ground became trapped, unable to shift, unable to rise. Their quiet groans echoed through the night, mingling with the wind beyond the walls. Some passed away in their sleep, gently, like a final breath, vanishing into the cold. The family grieved, but sometimes they also exhaled, knowing the old one was free from another brutal season. Cold from the earth reached into objects too. In the morning, water jars on the floor might have a film of ice across the top. Metal tools, knives, spoons, plough parts were freezing to the touch, biting at the skin. Bread, root vegetables, dried meat, stored near the ground, turned hard, unyielding. The whole house became like a cold cellar, half frozen and dim. People lived inside a storage room for ice. Sometimes peasants tried to warm the floor by scattering ash from the fire over it. Dry ash held heat better than wet straw, and it didn't rot as fast, but it clung to skin. It dirtied hands and feet. When stirred up, it filled the air, harsh to breathe, making people cough. Some clever souls tried raising the floor, laying boards over bricks or stones. But poor families couldn't afford such things. And so most lived with the cold, always rising, always present. Over time, that cold left its mark. Back pain became a lifelong companion. Winter might pass, but the stiffness, the soreness remained. Many reached their 40s already bent, already slowed, joints aged beyond their years. Cold didn't just steal sleep, it stole health year after year. Compared to other regions, this hardship stood out. In Russia or Scandinavia, people built wooden floors, log homes, better heat retention. But in much of medieval Europe, peasants had no such luxury. They lived on earth, with only a thin mat of straw between their bodies and the ground beneath. That made their winters longer, heavier, and turned every night into a quiet struggle against cold soil. If one memory could sum up the feeling of a winter in a mud and thatch hut, it would be the memory of cold creeping upward from the earth, silent but relentless. You could block the wind with walls, you could hold fire in a hearth, but the ground offered no mercy. Every night was a meeting with its slow, steady power. And each morning, if you found breath still in your lungs, it meant your body had won. One more time. In a winter, mud and thatch home, when the cold from the ground and the wind had slipped into every crack, the only thing standing between a person and the freezing death outside was the fire. It wasn't by chance that in every peasant home the hearth always sat at the center. It was the only light, the only stove, the only source of warmth. People called it the heart of the home, and truly, when the fire went out, it was as if the house had stopped breathing. In winter, fire was never a luxury. It was life itself. Picture an evening, long after the sun is gone, cold wind threading through the thatch above. The whole family sits around the hearth in the center of the room. The fire doesn't blaze, it glows, red and quiet, like little eyes blinking in the dark. That dim light touches their faces, slowing everything down. Children huddle against their parents, eyes gleaming as they watch the sparks dance. The elderly pull their wool blankets close, warming trembling hands, breathing in the sting of smoke. And in that moment, it feels like the whole house exists only to keep the coals from dying. But fire is not easy to keep. Wood is scarce in winter, especially for poor peasants. They couldn't afford to chop down trees at will. Instead, they gathered dry branches, leftover straw, sometimes even dried animal dung to burn. The fire, as a result, smoked more than it burned, pungent and thick. Smoke crept through the thatch, blackening the walls, settling onto every surface. Every pot, every bowl, even people's hair and clothing, all held the smell of smoke permanently. To live in a peasant's home was to live with smoke. That smoke in some way became part of life. It drove away insects, it cured hanging meats. It helped preserve the roof, but it also wore down their lungs. People coughed, dry, raspy, constant. They developed bronchitis. Some had lung disease before reaching adulthood. Children grew up with watery eyes, sore throats, but no one complained, because to have no smoke meant to have no fire, and to have no fire was to have no life. Keeping the fire alive overnight was a survival skill. No one wanted to wake in the freezing dark and start from scratch, especially when wood was low. So peasants used a method called banking the fire. Before bed, they didn't let it burn out, nor let it blaze. They buried the hot embers under a blanket of ash, sometimes covered with straw, or a thin layer of earth. This shield kept the coals glowing through the night, and by morning, all it took was a gentle breath to bring the flame back. Thanks to that trick, the family avoided fumbling in the dark for a dry twig to strike against flint. But the method didn't always work. Too much ash and the coals died completely. Come morning, they had to start from nothing. Too little ash and the fire might smolder into the straw, setting the whole house ablaze. Many homes were lost in the dead of night, burned down by a single coal gone wandering. People lived in that fragile balance, enough fire to survive the next day, but not so much it became disaster. Gathering around the fire was also a communal ritual. Each night, the families circled the hearth, not just to warm themselves, but to speak, to tell stories, to whisper prayers. The crackling of wood, the smell of smoke, the flickering light. It all created a soft rhythm that lulled them towards sleep. Children were often the first to drift off, mumbling the last lines of stories left unfinished. The adults waited until the coals settled into a quiet red before daring to lie down. Interestingly, the fire didn't only warm people, but animals too. Cows, goats, chickens. They were often kept in the main room or just beside it. The heat from the hearth mingled with the warm breath of livestock. In the winter night, the sounds of snorting cattle, clucking hens and bleating goats rose alongside the crackling of wood. It was the soundtrack of a medieval winter, chaotic but familiar. The fire also carried meaning. It witnessed small rituals, a cup of wine warmed, a loaf of bread toasted, a stew left to simmer. It listened to family secrets, to murmured plans. In a world so dark and cold, fire felt like a fragment of the sun held captive inside the home, a reminder that tomorrow would still come, that life somehow would continue. There were mornings when they woke to find the coals gone cold, the house as silent and frozen as a tomb. The family would shiver, fumbling with flint, trying to begin again. Fingers, purple with cold, clumsily struck sparks. Damp sticks refused to catch. When the flame finally returned, it wasn't just comfort. It was joy, a sense that death had been pushed back. One more day. But fire was never harmless. Without a chimney, smoke built up. Sometimes the wind shifted, trapping the fumes inside. Everyone would wake up with burning eyes, raw throats, and a cough that wouldn't leave. Worse still, when coals smoldered too long, invisible gases would creep across the floor. A family could slip quietly into unconsciousness and never wake again. It's possible that many winter deaths in the Middle Ages didn't come from cold, but from the very fire meant to save them. For children, winter memories were tied to the hearth. They remembered sitting near the embers, turning their backs to the heat, then dashing off to bed before the warmth faded. They remembered the scent of smoke in their hair, their mother's eyes squinting through the haze, their father's careful hands arranging the next piece of wood. Those memories etched deep, so that even years later, the smell of firewood smoke could summon an entire childhood. In that world, the fire truly was the heart of the home, fragile but enduring. It was the thin line between life and death, between night and dawn. Peasants had few possessions, few comforts, but they had a fire, and as long as it burned, they held on to the hope of making it through the winter. If the mud and thatch house was the body, then the hearth was its heartbeat. Each crackle was a pulse, each curl of smoke a breath. And when the family lay down to sleep, it was those glowing coals that kept their dreams from turning into death. A medieval winter was never gentle. But in that cold darkness, a small fire was enough to make the world feel a little less frightening. In a medieval peasant's home, winter sleep was never a private affair. There were no separate bedrooms, no personal beds, no such thing as personal space. When the sun had set and the fire had been banked beneath its blanket of ash, everyone laid out straw, blankets, or scraps of old cloth on the packed earth, crowding together. Children slept in the middle, parents on either side, grandparents, siblings, sometimes even neighbors or travelers needing shelter were pulled in, and not just people. On the coldest nights, livestock came indoors too. Cows, sheep, goats, chickens, even pigs. All shared breath within the low, smoky space of the mud and thatch home. Not because anyone wanted it that way, but because it was the only way to stay warm. Body heat, combined, was enough to keep the cutting cold from fully creeping in. In a world without iron stoves, without coal, without insulation, the human body was the only energy source they could rely on. Picture that scene. The house dim, lit only by the faint glow of buried coals, the air thick with the scent of smoke, sweat, damp earth, and dry grass. People lay so close their breath warmed each other's necks. The sounds, snoring, coughing, shifting, the wet breath of cattle, the flutter of wings in the dark. Beneath coarse wool blankets or stiff animal hides, the heat felt damp, heavy, sometimes stifling, but always better than the cold outside. Every child remembered that stifling warmth. They pressed into their mother's chest, listening to her heart, feeling both comforted and short of breath. Sometimes they jolted awake from the squeal of a pig or the clatter of hooves against the floor. But they drifted back, lulled by the rhythm of a dozen slow, steady breaths all around. For them, the world was a warm, humid cocoon, crowded, noisy, and never fully still. Adults weren't any more comfortable. Pressed together, personal habits disappeared. When one person coughed, everyone heard. When someone turned, the whole blanket shifted. Some mornings, bruises showed where a stray elbow had landed. Some nights, a child wet the straw, and there was nothing to do but endure it. The mess would be cleaned in the morning, but the smell stayed. And yet, oddly, that closeness meant safety. In winter, freezing to death was always a possibility. One person sleeping alone away from the group could be lost to the cold. But nestled in the middle, the body stayed warm, even if it meant breathing in sour air, even if it meant giving up space. Peasants didn't need to study thermodynamics, they just knew. Stay close, you live. Stay apart, you die. Livestock added their own layer to the night's atmosphere. The heavy breath of cattle puffed into ghostly clouds in the dark. Sheep bleated now and then, as if they too were dreaming uneasily. Pigs grunted, sometimes bumping into the walls and waking everyone. And chickens, sensitive to the soft glow of ember light, might crow out of rhythm, hours before dawn. All those noises blended into an improvised winter symphony, chaotic but essential. And the smell, always the smell. Unwashed wool, sweat from the day's labor, damp earth, smoke, manure and urine. Modern noses might recoil, but to the medieval peasant, it was simply the smell of life. Some even took comfort in the breath of a cow beside them, because it meant the animal was alive, and spring would still bring milk, meat, and muscle for the plough. The cramped quarters taught people to control their breath. Deep inhales brought smoke and stink into the lungs, so many learned to breathe in short, shallow rhythms, a quiet form of protection. Over time, this became a kind of survival instinct. In a world of dust, smoke, and odor, breathing lightly became the gentlest way through the night. Children were always placed in the center, the safest, warmest spot. The elderly often lay near the walls, colder places, but they gave up the warmth to protect the young. And each morning, as the first light filtered through the thatch, the house didn't wake to an alarm. It woke to the sound of animals stirring, of children crying, of fires being rekindled. In that world, sleep was never peaceful. But it was never entirely unsafe either. It was survival sleep, where humans and animals breathed together, warmed each other, endured together. Children raised in such homes carried those nights for life. As adults, sleeping in quiet, empty rooms might feel hollow, even unsettling, because for them, safety was never silent. It came with their father's snore, their mother's cough, a cow's slow breath, and the scent of smoke in their clothes. To them, perfect silence felt like a warning, the kind of quiet that meant something, or someone, was gone. The habit of sleeping together reflected a society bound tight. In a world where winter could take you overnight, closeness was not just culture, it was survival. No one asked about privacy. No one complained about space. Each person was part of the group, a source of warmth in the collective, and only the collective could make it through. If you could travel back, step into one of those mud and thatch homes on a winter night, your first impression would probably be the smell, then the sound, and finally, the sight. A tangle of bodies curled beneath rough wool, pressed together like dried fish in a basket. And then you'd understand how they survived, not because they had much, not because they had modern tools, but simply because they knew how to lie beside one another. In the ruthless cold of a medieval winter, the warmth of another body was the rarest luxury of all. A medieval winter didn't just test individual homes, it tested entire communities. Because in a cold that stretched on for months, a single isolated family could easily fall. That's why small villages where everyone knew their neighbors by name became fragile safety nets. One person lent another a few sticks of wood, traded a handful of dried grain for a bucket of milk, or simply sat together, sharing warmth. Without that kind of help, many wouldn't have made it through the long, bitter night. Peasants didn't have much. Everything was in short supply, and that was precisely why they learned to share. A hard loaf of bread could be split into many pieces. A thin pot of stew could be stretched with water to feed a few more mouths. There were nights when nothing was left in the house, and someone would knock on a neighbor's door. No one turned them away, because everyone understood that one day they too would need kindness. In the cruelty of winter, survival stopped being personal. It became collective, and in that context prayer became essential. Before meals, before bed, before lighting the fire. People murmured their thoughts toward God, not because they expected miracles, not because they thought bread or dry wood would fall from the sky, but because prayer brought comfort. In the darkness of the hut, with wind howling outside and the wooden beams groaning from cold, those whispered verses became a thread, a connection to something larger than themselves, to believe that God was watching, to believe that spring would come, to believe that death wasn't the end, that faith held their spirits up even when their bodies began to fail. Some days the entire village gathered at the church, even in snow, even in ice. The church bell rang sharp and far in the frozen air. People huddled in the cramped space, their breath rising in white clouds, listening to the priest read sacred words. then lifting their voices together in song. It was ritual. It was resistance. It was a reminder that no one was alone. Even though each returned to a separate, freezing home, they belonged to something greater. They suffered together, and they hoped together. Still, not everyone survived. Every winter there were always some, the elderly, the weak, who couldn't make it. A fever, a persistent cough, or simply the slow exhaustion of too many weeks with too little food and too little rest. Often someone was found still in bed, not stirring in the morning, their face calmer than the night had been. And though the loss hurt, many saw it as a release from pain, a final, quiet mercy. But winter didn't just take lives, it left scars. Children watched their grandparents, even parents, fade too soon. And that fear carved itself into memory. Adults lost workers, lost shoulders to lean on. Sometimes an entire village gathered to bury the dead in frozen ground, digging into earth hard as stone, listening to the iron shovel crack against frost and ice. Those moments made winter more than just a season. They made it a season of grief. And still life continued. After the funeral, people went back to chopping wood, patching clothes, herding animals, carrying water. Grief had no place to rest. The day's needs didn't wait. And from that harsh rhythm, a quiet kind of strength emerged, the strength of collective endurance. Stories played their part too. Children were told of harsher winters long ago, of ancestors who survived greater cold, greater hunger. Those stories weren't just memories. They were medicine. If the past had endured, then so could the future. Cold, hunger, even death became part of a shared memory, turned into lessons, into resilience, into belief. In that setting, winter wasn't just weather. It became almost a god, a harsh god, but a fair one. It returned every year, tested everyone, took the weakest, and left the survivors with a strange feeling: victory. And when spring came, when snow melted, when the ground softened underfoot, when green shoots broke the soil, people breathed deeply and felt as though they'd been reborn. Across other lands, the same truths held. In Russia, peasants in izbas, squat wooden houses with soot-darkened ceilings, slept side by side. They had big stoves, but not always enough wood. People slept on wooden benches beside the oven, curled up like cats, soaking in the last heat. In Scandinavia, where the frost lingered even longer, livestock were kept inside the home, letting the warmth of cows and sheep blend with the breath of the family. These traditions, scattered across distance, spoke the same truth. Cold drives people closer. From English meadows to Russian snowfields, from thatched huts to wooden cabins, winter always asked the same question: can you endure? And the answer, always, was, only if we endure together. As you can see, for medieval peasants, winter wasn't just weather, it was a trial, a season-long examination that returned every year, claiming the frail, forcing the living to huddle together just to make it through. And in that shared endurance, there was a quiet rhythm, repetitive, heavy, like the breath of an entire village. But not everyone in the Middle Ages lived beneath a thatched roof, curled up beside cows and sheep. In the very same winters, within the cold stone walls of distant castles, there were women who faced another kind of winter, not the winter of hunger or frost, but the winter of power, of calculation, of eyes watching from every corner of court. One of them was Anne Boleyn. Raised and educated in Europe, she entered the English court with something rare, an elegance, a sharpness, a presence that drew attention. Her path, from the love of a king to a queen's crown, and finally to the scaffold, was no less brutal, than the winters suffered by those in the fields. Only this winter came not with cold winds and empty stomachs, but with the storms of politics, ambition, and the silent weapons of royal power in 16th century England. So now step out of the smoke-filled cottages, away from the scent of straw and livestock breath, and into another world. Stone corridors, candlelight on silk, a place where even a whisper could seal a woman's fate. Anne Boleyn wasn't born in a stone palace, nor among church bells echoing through grand city squares. She entered the world around the year 1501 in the English countryside, a quiet place where the Boleyn family, though not of royal blood, held firm footing among the rising ranks of nobility. Their timber and stone home stood amidst wide fields not far from London, where dirt roads turned to thick mud in winter and clouds of dust in summer. From her earliest days, Anne stood at the threshold between two worlds. On one side, the daily rhythms of life steeped in smoke and damp earth, and on the other, a door slowly opening to courtly life, with its rituals, its language, and the delicate, dangerous shimmer of power. Her childhood was not loud nor dazzling. The days passed with quiet discipline. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, a man of clear ambition, her mother, Elizabeth Howard, descended from a noble family closely tied to the crown. Thomas, with diplomatic skill and sharp instinct, laid the foundation for his children's future, not simply in England, but beyond it. He sent them into Europe, into the glittering courts where culture and politics intertwined. For Anne, this meant leaving home while still very young. While other children warmed their hands by the hearth or played in muddy yards, Anne was sent to the Netherlands to serve at the court of Margaret of Austria. For an English girl in the early 16th century, this was no small step. The Netherlands was not like England. The air smelled different. The light fell differently. In winter, the canals froze and winds cut down from the north. In summer, church bells rang out above red-tiled roofs, and market chatter filled the narrow streets. At Margaret's court, Anne learned things she would never have encountered at home: the refinement of painting, the tone of diplomacy, and perhaps most importantly, the skill of observation. Margaret herself was a powerful woman, ruling a complex region with steady hands. Her voice, her decisions, her posture, they left their mark on the young girl watching from the edges of the room. But the Netherlands was just the beginning. A few years later, Anne was sent to France, the cultural heart of Europe. If the Netherlands taught her precision, France taught her grace. The court of King Francis I was known for its feasts, its dances, its playful charm, sometimes daring, sometimes crude. In this world, Anne learned how to dress with care, how to walk with elegance and confidence, and most crucially, how to wield wit like an ornament, not too sharp, but always shining. French was no longer a foreign tongue to her. It became her second language. The songs, the poems, the prose she read were soaked in romance and daydreams. Day by day, she absorbed not just the words, but the thinking, the cadence, the courtly grace of the French elite. And when she returned to England, she stood apart. While many noble women still clung to rigid manners and careful silence, Anne spoke with charm, moved with intention, and carried with her the subtle weight of Europe. But it wasn't just culture or language that shaped her. It was the blend, the discipline of the Netherlands and the elegance of France that formed Anne Boleyn's edge. She learned to listen, but also to know when to speak. She understood that power in court didn't reside solely on the throne, but in glances, in timing, in a single word spoken precisely when it mattered. We can imagine her, one evening in France, standing by a tall window, looking out over gardens lit by candlelight. A lute plays softly in the distance, laughter echoes from the great hall. In her hands, a slim leather-bound book of French verse. The candlelight casts a soft glow on her face, dreamlike but steady. This was no longer an anonymous English girl. This was someone being sharpened for a far larger stage, the English court. Her time in France also brought her close to ideas. She may have heard talk of Erasmus, felt the first stirrings of reform sweeping across Europe. Philosophy, religion, a shifting sense of authority and divinity. All of it poured into her mind like seeds, quiet at first, but destined to grow. When Anne returned to England, she was no longer ordinary. She carried with her a new language, a cultivated mind, and a presence that few had ever encountered. She entered the court with poise, speaking fluent French, blending subtlety with sharpness. And that combination made her impossible to ignore. In a world where every eye measured every gesture, being different wasn't always safe. But for Anne, it became a kind of power. Looking back, we can see how her childhood and education in Europe laid the groundwork for everything she would become. A queen, a symbol, a tragedy. Behind cold stone walls and beneath howling winds, Anne Boleyn had learned how to stand tall, how to glow, how to survive in a world where every smile could be a welcome or a trap. And it was in those years that her story truly began. When Anne Boleyn set foot again in England after years on the continent, she no longer resembled the noble women commonly seen at the Tudor court. Her difference wasn't loud, it was more like a quiet light, slipping through unnoticed until you looked directly at it. Fluent French, a rhythm in the way she walked, even the subtle tilt of her head when she listened. Everything about her carried a kind of foreign grace, both unfamiliar and magnetic. The court of Henry VIII, at the time of Anne's return, was a world of sound and spectacle. The great halls of Hampton Court, stone walls hung with heavy tapestries, echoed with laughter, the thud of boots on wooden floors, and a dense blend of wine, candle wax, animal hides, and smoke. This wasn't just the center of political power. It was a stage, a place where people came to be seen, to be remembered, to find opportunity. Into that scene, Anne arrived like a new performer, but not an uncertain one. She didn't dazzle with traditional beauty. In fact, many sources agree Anne didn't fit the era's ideal. She lacked the soft golden hair and porcelain skin so revered. But she had something else, a presence. Dark, intelligent eyes, a sharp gaze, a smile that suggested she understood more than she said. Her allure wasn't physical, but in the way she made people feel noticed, heard, understood. At a court used to silent women in the background, valued more for their dowry than their voice, Anne was something else. She joined conversations. She spoke French with ease. She quoted verses, melodies she'd heard in French salons. When others spoke, she listened with her head slightly tilted, eyes steady, and responded with a smile that was just right. Not too much to be forward, not too little to seem cold. In a room where every detail could be dissected, those gestures became a quiet power. The palace teemed with hundreds of figures, noblemen in gold-stitched coats, swords at their sides, ladies in layered gowns heavy with brocade. Among them, Anne stood out. Not through excess, but through intention. She chose her clothing carefully, never flashy, always refined, muted tones, one striking detail, a French lace trim, a small, well-placed cap. It suggested elegance and a familiarity with the fashions across the Channel. Henry VIII did not appear in her life right away. At first, Anne was simply another lady-in-waiting, assigned to serve Queen Catherine of Aragon. And in that role, she learned the art of palace movement, where to stand, when to speak, and when to disappear. But even in service, her difference became apparent. Catherine, the Queen, was pious, quiet, patient, a figure of tradition. Anne, by contrast, radiated something else, a quickness, a spark, a quiet challenge to the expected. It was said that when Anne spoke with someone, she had the rare gift of making them feel as though they were the only person in the room. Her eyes didn't wander. She listened with stillness and replied in a voice even soft but firm. At court, where words often vanished into stone walls, that kind of attention was like a candle quietly burning in the dark. To the men of the court, Anne wasn't an obvious beauty to be pursued. She was an intellect to be tested. She didn't flirt easily. She didn't say yes quickly. She didn't shrink into modest silence. Some found this irritating, but others, those drawn to challenge, found it irresistible. Picture a banquet in the palace. A long hall lit by hundreds of candles, light flickering in silver goblets, glinting off embroidered tapestries. Music floats through the air. Steps spin to the rhythm of dance. And in one corner, Anne stands in quiet conversation. Not loud, not performing, but people notice. Instead of laughing too hard or speaking too much, she chooses her words, sets them gently into the conversation, making those around her lean in. In Tudor England, being different was a double-edged sword. It could open doors, but it could also sharpen envy. At first, Anne's difference made her intriguing, a new current in a stagnant pond. But slowly it drew whispers, eyes, suspicion. Her sharpness wasn't just in speech, it was in how she read the room. She knew the court was a game, every word, every step, a potential political move. She saw the change as Catherine aged, as her favour with Henry VIII dimmed, as her inability to produce a male heir left space that others rushed to fill. But Anne didn't rush. She stepped back, watched, and waited. That patience, blended with a quiet self-possession, made her different. She wasn't noticed by chance. She positioned herself with care. In a world where the king's attention could be salvation or ruin, caution was not weakness, it was wisdom. When she returned to England, Anne Boleyn brought more than European language and Polish. She brought a rare sharpness, not a flower to be admired, but a strange new piece that made those around her reassess the board. She wasn't what women at court were expected to be, and in that difference lay the spark that would ignite her fated entanglement with Henry VIII, a bond that would not only seal her own fate, but reshape the very course of English history. Henry VIII was no stranger to love, nor was he unfamiliar with desire. Before Anne Boleyn, he had a wife, mistresses, and even illegitimate children. But his encounter with Anne was different. It wasn't a fleeting passion like the heady rush of wine. It was a slow-burning storm, one that crept into every crack of the Tudor court and eventually exploded into a national crisis. When Henry first noticed Anne, she was no nameless maiden. She had built a place for herself at court, intelligent, poised, and, most crucially, she said no. For a king accustomed to submission, her refusal was like strong liquor. The more he drank, the thirstier he became. Henry, always the sun around which others revolved, found himself drawn to a woman who dared to say no. And in that no, he found a challenge he could not look away from. The letters Henry wrote to Anne reveal the depth of his obsession. His handwriting trembled. His lines were long, sometimes lacking the royal formality expected in monarch's correspondence. In one letter, he confessed, I cannot stop thinking of you even when I am with my council. In another, he admitted the pain of being rejected but pledged he would not stop pursuing her. Those letters, written on vellum with dark ink that still survives, stand today as witnesses to a love that altered a kingdom. Anne, in this relationship, was not swept away. She didn't rush into the king's arms. Instead, she set her terms. She would not be a mistress. She would not be a passing indulgence. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. For most men, that would already be a challenge. But for a king who was already married to Catherine of Aragon, it was a mountain nearly impossible to climb. Henry had been married to Catherine for nearly 20 years. She was devout, loyal, and had borne him many children, but none of the sons had survived. Haunted by the need for a legitimate male heir, and inflamed with passion for Anne, Henry began seeking an annulment. But this wasn't merely a personal matter. In the 16th century, royal marriages were deeply tied to the church, and to undo a marriage recognized by the Pope, Henry needed approval from Rome. He turned to the Bible, arguing that marrying Catherine, his brother's widow, violated God's law. He claimed the union was cursed, and the lack of a male heir proved it. But Catherine refused to yield. She insisted her marriage was lawful and vowed to defend it. With the support of the English people and of her powerful homeland, Spain, she turned the issue from a romantic conflict into a geopolitical battle. The Vatican would not be easily swayed. Pope Clement VII, entangled in the chaos of European politics, especially after Rome was sacked by troops loyal to Charles V, Catherine's nephew, could not afford to side with Henry. To annul the marriage would mean crossing the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Denied the support he sought, Henry's frustration grew, not just at the Pope, but at the very system that limited his authority. He came to believe that as King of England he should not have his marriage dictated by a distant foreign ruler. And so a private affair became a political and religious confrontation. The Tudor court erupted in fiery debate. Preachers gave sermons. The public split into factions. Some stood with Catherine and the Pope, condemning annulment as sinful. Others, backing Henry, argued he needed an heir, and that a king should decide his fate. Anne, throughout it all, did not waver. She refused to yield. She would not accept being a shadow lover. And her resolve only deepened Henry's obsession. To him, Anne was no longer just a woman. She became a symbol of England's independence from Rome and of his own sovereign power. To have Anne, Henry was willing to defy the Pope himself. When Rome continued to delay, he chose a new path to separate England from the Catholic Church. In 1533, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine void and wed Anne. The Pope excommunicated him, one of the harshest spiritual punishments. But Henry did not back down. He founded the Church of England, placing himself at its head. It was not merely a gesture for love, it was a turning point that reshaped England's religious and political future. And it all began with love letters, with glances, with refusals. What started as a private passion became a national upheaval, where love and power merged, sending an entire kingdom onto a new path. In the room where Henry penned his letters to Anne, by candlelight, with ink smudged in corners, he could not have imagined that his words would shake all of Europe. But that is how history often works. The most personal things can leave the deepest marks. When the church bells rang out to announce that Anne Boleyn was now Queen of England, many believed it marked the beginning of a new era. But that era, instead of shining bright like the brocade gowns she wore at her coronation, quickly turned grey. The throne Anne had won through resolve and cleverness was also a seat that swayed, always balanced above a waiting abyss. She stepped into her role as queen carrying a heavy burden. She had to bear a son. To Henry VIII, a man who had spent years seeking a wife who could give him a male heir. This was not just a hope, but a purpose. The Tudor dynasty, young and still fragile, needed a boy to secure its future. And Anne, somehow, accepted that burden as part of the love she had chosen. In September of 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child. It was not a boy, but a girl. The child was named Elizabeth. To Anne, she was still a boundless joy. She believed a mother could find happiness in any child. Elizabeth, in her tiny movements and cries, was proof of the love and power Anne had fought for. But to Henry, that joy quickly gave way to disappointment. He had waited for a prince, a future king, to strengthen his crown. A princess, no matter how beautiful or healthy, was not what he had desired. The whispers began. People murmured that Henry's marriage to Catherine had been cursed, and now so too was this one. Some claimed it was a sign that God did not bless the union. Every glance, every hushed comment was a needle pricking at Anne's standing. Still, Anne did not give up. She believed there would be more children, that a son would come. But the pregnancies that followed brought only heartbreak. There were miscarriages, or children that did not survive. With each loss, the distance between Anne and Henry grew wider. In the cold corridors of the palace, she must have heard the echo of his disappointment, heavy as breath in the dead of winter. Henry was not simply a disappointed husband. He was a king haunted by succession, and he began to look elsewhere. His eyes turned to Jane Seymour, a gentlewoman with little ambition, so unlike Anne. If Anne had drawn him in with resistance and boldness, Jane lured him with meekness and quiet grace. The contrast between the two women only deepened Anne's unease. She was no longer the woman Henry had once pursued with trembling letters. She was a queen surrounded by enemies. Many who had once been loyal to Catherine still saw Anne as a usurper. They hadn't forgotten the humiliation Catherine endured, or that Henry had broken with the church just to marry Anne. To them, Anne's failure was sweet revenge. Anne, sharp and outspoken, was not one to remain silent. She argued, sometimes openly, with Henry. In a court where women were expected to be soft-spoken and submissive, her frankness became a double-edged sword. It had once fascinated Henry. Now it wore him down. At banquets, Anne still appeared radiant, draped in rich fabrics, jewels glowing under candlelight. But the splendor could not hide her inner fear. Each time Jane Seymour bowed to Henry with humble posture, Anne felt her place slipping. Each rumor of miscarriage, each whisper about her failing health made the throne beneath her feel less certain. Henry, in those days, began to drift away. The letters stopped, the longing gaze faded. In their place, cold silences at shared meals, a quiet indifference that stung more than anger. He turned to Jane for comfort, while Anne became increasingly isolated. The fall from favor did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like cold, rising through bare feet on stone. Each political maneuver, each accusation from opposing factions, was another layer of frost around her. Anne, once the flame that made Henry defy Rome, was now a candle flickering in the wind. The Tudor court, always steeped in intrigue, offered no mercy. When a queen no longer served her purpose, old and new enemies closed in. Anne, from the highest point of power, began to descend into isolation, into danger. And in one of history's strange ironies, the little girl who had once disappointed Henry, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs. But at that time, no one could see that future. All they saw was a queen who had failed to bear a prince, a wife being quietly replaced, a woman nearing the edge of tragedy. In those cold stone chambers under flickering candlelight, Anne must have felt the widening space between her and Henry. Not just between husband and wife, but between a queen and the crown she had once conquered. And as each day passed, the echoes of failure grew louder, heralding what was to come. In the final months of her life, Anne Boleyn lived surrounded by cold stares. No more days of Henry writing her love letters or showering her with lavish gifts. Instead came sidelong glances, long silences, and whispered rumors she could no longer silence. The Tudor court, once glowing under candlelight, became a prison of polished mirrors for Anne, where every forced smile reflected danger. The man who accelerated her downfall was none other than Thomas Cromwell, Henry's closest advisor. Once an ally in the downfall of Catherine and the creation of the Church of England, Cromwell had now become Anne's adversary. Two sharp, ambitious minds could not coexist forever. Anne wanted power concentrated in the monarchy, in the hands of king and queen. Cromwell sought to expand his own influence. Clashes over policy, over confiscated church lands, over courtly authority, all turned alliance into rivalry. And in a court like Tudor England's, rivals often met the same end. Cromwell understood Henry's fatigue. Anne had failed to deliver a son. Her temperament grew unpredictable, and the sharpness that once captivated the king now became an irritant. Cromwell saw his moment to tighten his grip on power and clear the path for Jane Seymour. A plan began to form, slow, deliberate, like a spiderweb creeping across the ceiling. In May of 1536, the accusations came. Anne was charged with adultery, not with one man but several, including her own brother, George Boleyn. It wasn't just slander, it was total character assassination. An adulterous queen meant treason, for if the heir to the throne might not be the king's child, the entire royal line was compromised. The evidence was flimsy, confessions extracted under pressure, gossip twisted into damning testimony. But in a court already turned cold, truth mattered less than momentum. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, a symbol of royal power, now her prison. Imagine the morning she was taken. Heavy footsteps echoed through the palace, the corridors dim with May light, filtered through narrow windows onto cold stone walls. Anne, no longer wrapped in velvet, wore a simple dress. The curtsies and greetings were gone. No one called her Your Majesty. Only the soft clink of chains and the echo of boots on stone. In the tower, Anne had time to think. She prayed. Some say she even laughed. At the absurdity of the charges, she knew there would be no rescue, but her resolve did not waver. To some, it was resignation. To Anne, perhaps, it was simply the final move in a game she had played for too long. The trial came swiftly. A hand-picked council of nobles convened. The verdict had already been written. Henry wanted to be free. Cromwell wanted to prove his power. The charges were read. Witnesses took the stand. Even her brother George was swept into the machinery of destruction. No one was spared. Anne stood before the court and denied everything. She didn't sob, she didn't beg. Her voice, records say, was calm and clear. She declared her loyalty to Henry, denied the accusations, and called on God as witness. But truth held no place here. The trial was theatre. The script already inked. The sentence, death by execution. Not by axe, as was customary, but by sword. A rare concession, perhaps from Henry, perhaps for a cleaner end. A swordsman from France was summoned, famous for his speed and precision. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. The sky was overcast, the wind damp from the Thames. She wore a simple black cloak, a hood drawn over her head. Only a small crowd gathered, nobles, guards, curious onlookers. Anne knelt. She didn't beg for life, she prayed for Henry, called him a kind and gentle king. Her last words, both prayer and bitter truth. The executioner, sword hidden behind his back, stepped forward. In that moment, time froze. Then, with a single stroke, it was over. Anne Boleyn, the queen who had transformed a kingdom, fell silent, like a candle snuffed out. Her death was not just the end of a life. It was a warning that in the Tudor court, power and favour could vanish faster than breath on a cold night. Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour the very next day, as if Anne had never existed. But her legacy did not vanish. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow to become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. The irony is cruel. The child Henry once saw as a failure became the brightest jewel of the Tudor crown. Seen in a broader lens, Anne's tragedy was not unique. European history is filled with queens and empresses who paid dearly for power. Marie Antoinette, more than 2 centuries later, mounted the scaffold in Paris, her head falling beneath the guillotine, a symbol of excess and ruin. Mary, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned and executed by her own cousin, Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. In Russia, Tsarina Alexandra Romanov, though not beheaded in public, met her end in a cold basement under the rifles of revolution. Each of these deaths, different in shape, carried the same truth. In a world ruled by men, female power was always precarious. One wrong step, one misplaced glance, and the price was death. Anne Boleyn, with all her wit and ambition, went further than most women of her time. But those same qualities, in a world unready to accept them, became unforgivable. The cost of female power, then, was not only blood spilled at the scaffold, it was the whispers in the palace, the suspicion of the crowd, the fragility of a crown never truly hers. And Anne, with all she lived, all she loved and all she lost, became a symbol of that bitter truth. The death of Anne Boleyn closed a chapter both brilliant and sorrowful in the history of England. A woman who once shook the throne, who changed the religion of an entire kingdom, was, in the end, brought down by the very hands of power she had once helped mold. And yet her legacy endured, quietly, steadily, through Elizabeth I, who would one day lead England into a golden age. But history never lingers in one palace, nor ends with one reign. Its stories press on, across oceans, across centuries. If, in 16th century Europe, a marriage and a trial could shift the course of politics and faith, then across the Atlantic, in the 18th century, a cup of tea would rattle an empire. This next story takes place not in a stone castle or a gilded council chamber, but on the frigid docks of Boston. There the colonists, tired of distant decrees from London, chose a winter night to send their own message. Not in stirring speeches, but in chests of tea hurled into black water. And now we quietly drift with the current of history, from the cold corridors of the Tower of London to the narrow streets and harbours of Boston in 1773, where a single silent night would become the thunderclap that opened the storm of revolution. Imagine this. It had been decades since the first English settlers set foot on the land that would later be called the American colonies. They brought with them memories of grey stone villages, damp meadows of Europe, and planted new roots in this distant, unfamiliar soil. Over generations, small wooden towns grew along the coast, farms stretched out along river valleys, and dirt roads wandered into thin forests. Life here was harsh, but in its place it gave them something else, a sense of independence, Colonial people had long grown used to planting their own crops, trading their own goods, making decisions within their own communities. They still called themselves English, but they were no longer like those who lived in London or Bristol. Then came the 18th century, and with it, a slow building pressure. The British Empire, exhausted and indebted after costly wars with France and other European powers, needed money. In London, ministers and lawmakers sat in high-ceilinged rooms with thick windows, debating how to plug the holes in their treasury. They turned their eyes to the colonies, a land bustling with trade and growth, and thought, Americans should share this burden. To them, it was reasonable. To the people of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, it was an insult. One by one, tax laws were passed. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, then duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Items once mundane, a newspaper, a contract, a morning cup of tea, now became proof of control by a parliament across the ocean where no colonist had a seat. A slogan echoed in taverns and town meetings: no taxation without representation. In low-roofed homes with candles flickering over long tables, debate ran deep. Some remained loyal to the crown, insisting taxes were a duty. But many, especially merchants, felt strangled. Boston, once a thriving port, its wooden ships sailing to the Caribbean and Europe, now simmered like a kettle on the fire. Everyone could feel the heat. No one knew when it would boil. Tension wasn't just written into laws, it filled the very air. When ships docked, carrying crates of tea from the British East India Company, the people of Boston didn't just see tea, they saw the long shadow of Westminster and aging MPs who had never stepped foot in America writing rules for every sip they took. Redcoats began appearing more often in the streets. Their scarlet uniforms stood out in every crowd. Bootsteps echoed on cobblestone. Vendors, sailors, housewives all felt they now lived in a city being watched. Any gathering could be observed. A word spoken too loudly could be remembered. In this climate, meetings became pressure valves. The old South Meeting House, a large brick building with tall windows, once used for religious gatherings, now overflowed with Boston citizens. Hundreds crammed in, breath thick in the winter air, to hear speeches ring off the wooden floorboards, cheering, shouting, stomping feet. They spoke of rights, of liberty, of whether ordinary men should let strangers decide their fate. Each new law from London was like another sheet of ice laid over an already frozen river. And just as medieval peasants had once endured brutal winters, the people of Boston now felt a political cold settling into everyday life. It crept into meals, into tankards of ale, into hushed conversations at the corner shop. No one knew exactly when the line would be crossed, but everyone knew it was near. Frustration was rising like water in a barrel, waiting for one final drop. The word resistance was first whispered, then spoken. Smuggled newspapers changed hands, cartoons mocking redcoats, and British officials spread from coffeehouse to harbour. Boston had become a tightly packed fuse. Each day brought more tension, more anger, and at some point, with just the smallest spark, a law about tea, an undelivered shipment, would be enough to light the fire. A fire that would cross oceans. When tensions from a string of earlier laws had yet to settle, Parliament passed another decision in 1773, a measure that seemed simple on paper, but in truth was like placing a pot of boiling water over open flame. The Tea Act. On the surface, it looked like a practical solution. The British East India Company, one of the empire's largest and most important trading powers, was teetering on the edge of collapse. Its London warehouses were stacked with mouldy crates of unsold tea. The British government believed that by allowing the company to sell tea directly to the American colonies at a cheaper price, bypassing colonial merchants, they could save the company and please colonists with a lower price. A neat calculation, a number easily scribbled onto a chalkboard in the offices of Westminster. But in Boston, the people didn't see cheap tea, they saw a trap. Because even at a lower cost, each crate still carried a hidden tax. A tax that symbolized the very thing they had protested for years. The power of a distant parliament imposing itself on daily life without consent, without representation. In low-roofed taverns where lamplight flickered on smoke-stained walls, the talk of tea became the hottest topic in the room. Mugs of ale slammed against wooden tables, rough voices rose up, mingling with the crackling of fire in stone hearths. One man scoffed, "Cheap tea? The real price isn't in pennies, it's in submission." Another growled, "Every sip is a sip of surrender." Through thick clouds of tobacco smoke, the whispers of resistance grew louder, until they became cries of refusal. Formal meetings echoed that same energy. At Old South Meeting House, with its tall ceilings and windows casting pale winter light, Boston citizens gathered again and again. Hundreds, then thousands, crowded inside. Boots creaked across the wooden floor, breath clouded the frigid air. Everyone came to hear, and everyone came to speak. On the wooden platform, familiar voices rose: Samuel Adams, John Hancock, James Otis. Not with microphones, not with perfect oration, but as ordinary men shouting across a restless crowd. They spoke of liberty, of dignity, of the insult in letting a monopoly dictate prices, and more importantly, if they accepted this tea, what else would they be forced to accept tomorrow? Not everyone agreed. Some argued, "It's just tea, drink it if it keeps hunger away." Merchants worried about trade with Britain, about ports and markets they still relied on. But the more they argued, the tighter the room felt. The tension built like steam inside a sealed kettle with no release. Out on the waterfront, ships from England had already arrived, their decks heavy with crates of tea, waiting silently in the harbour. Sailors stood beside them, arms crossed, nervous, curious. They were just doing their jobs, but they could feel the eyes of Boston burning into every crate. Days passed. No one dared unload the cargo. Each box sat like a powder keg. Touch it, and it might explode. In that strange stretch of waiting, the whole city seemed to hold its breath. Shoppers in the marketplace talked about tea. Street vendors muttered about tea. The church bells tolled the hours, but everyone was counting down to something else. A decision had to be made, either accept or act. And so meeting followed meeting. Shouts of "refuse it" rose from hundreds of throats. Boston was no longer just a port city. It had become a vast pressure cooker filled with steam and fury, needing only a single crack for everything to blow. December 16th, 1773 began much like any other winter day in Boston. The sky was grey, the wind off Massachusetts Bay carried dampness and chill. Wooden rooftops were coated with a fine layer of frost. Chimney smoke curled blue and thin into the low clouds. In the uneven cobbled streets, people moved faster, wore thicker coats, their shoulders hunched to keep warmth in their bodies. But inside them, it wasn't just breath that warmed, it was anticipation. Since the meetings at Old South Meeting House, rumors had spread like wildfire. Today would be the deciding day, the crates of tea still sitting at the harbour on 3 ships. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver had become the focus of every gaze. Colonial authorities pushed for the cargo to be unloaded. Ship owners feared losing their licenses. Citizens insisted that not a single crate be allowed to touch Boston soil. Every road, every thought pointed to the harbour. As dusk fell, thousands once again gathered at the meeting house. The room glowed faintly with smoky candlelight. The air was thick, with people, with breath, with cold seeping in through wooden cracks. Bodies pressed together for warmth. Voices buzzed and clashed. Samuel Adams, his voice hoarse, ended the gathering with a short phrase that everyone understood. "This meeting can do nothing more." His words fell like a silent drumbeat. The crowd began to move, like a river spilling its banks. When they poured into the streets, night had already come. Oil lanterns cast yellowish light over stone pathways. The sea breeze blew harder, bringing with it the scent of salt, rotting wood, and expectation. From the crowd, a group of about 50 broke off. They pulled hoods low, draped themselves in torn blankets, wrapped in furs, turning themselves into dark, ragged silhouettes of Mohawk warriors. No one mistook them for actual Native Americans, but no one said a word. The disguise served its purpose, to create distance, to hide identities, to silently declare, "This is no individual's act, this is the act of a people." The group made their way to the docks. Boots thudded against wooden planks, mixing with the whistle of wind through taut rigging lines. The tall ships loomed in darkness, their anchor ropes creaking like mournful groans. Moonlight spread in patches across the water, each ripple slapping gently against the hull, as if counting down to what was about to happen. When the disguised men stepped onto the deck, there were no cheers, no war drums, only silence, determined, cold. They carried axes, clubs, and a few short knives. Rough hands gripped crates, dry wood cracked and groaned. An axe struck, the first lid split open. The scent of dry tea rose into the air, sweet, bitter, sharp, wafting across the deck. Then came more crates, wood splintered with sharp cracks. Tea leaves poured out like water, spilling into the wind. They lifted, rolled, and heaved the heavy boxes overboard. Each splash echoed, followed by water bursting upward. The sea quickly became covered in floating, glistening leaves, like dark fragments of paper rising, drifting, then sinking into the cold. On shore, the people watched in silence. There were no victory shouts, only heavy breaths puffing white in the dark. Now and then, a child gasped as another crate hit the water, only to be gently hushed by a parent's hand on the shoulder. The entire scene felt ritualistic. No speeches, no slogans, just crate after crate, each splash a message louder than any sermon. Within a few hours, 342 chests of tea, worth tens of thousands of British pounds, were gone. The disguised men moved with uncanny discipline. They damaged nothing else. They stole nothing. They even swept the decks clean afterward, leaving behind a strange kind of order, as if they had come not to riot, but to send a message. When it was done, the wind grew sharper, the scent of tea now lingering in the air. The sea rippled gently. Tea leaves bobbed and sank like silent witnesses. The crowd on shore quietly dispersed in small clusters. No shouting, no celebration. Only the knowledge that they had seen something that would be remembered. That night, Boston was eerily quiet. Lanterns dimmed, the streets emptied. But in the darkness, everyone knew a line had been crossed, and there would be no going back. When morning came, Boston Harbor no longer felt the same. The sea breeze still carried the scent of salt, and small boats still bobbed on the bay. But the water now had a different smell. Hundreds of tea chests, hurled into the sea the night before, had begun to break apart, steeping the harbor in a bitter, earthy fragrance. Fishermen who rowed through the area said the water looked darker, like a thick, shadowy carpet stretched across the waves. Seagulls flew lower, drawn to the strange aroma of tea leaves blooming in the tide. Boston had sent a message, and now All waited for the reply. The news crossed the ocean swiftly. Within weeks it reached the British Parliament and the Crown. In London, within rooms lined with thick carpets and high windows, anger rippled through Parliament. To them, this wasn't about ruined tea. This was a direct challenge to royal authority and the dignity of the empire. A colony had destroyed property belonging to the East India Company, one of Britain's greatest commercial prides. Such defiance could not be tolerated. Heated debates broke out. Some called for negotiation, reminding their peers that taxation had long stirred unrest, but those voices were faint amid the rising fury. Most agreed punishment must be swift and severe. If Boston went unpunished, then New York, Philadelphia, or any port could follow. The empire would begin to unravel, and so the laws began to take shape, what Britain called the Coercive Acts, but what Americans soon renamed with darker words, the Intolerable Acts. The first blow landed hard, the Boston Port Act. As of June 1st, 1774, the port of Boston was closed. No merchant ship could enter or leave until the entire cost of the destroyed tea had been repaid. For a city that lived by its harbor, this was a tightening noose. Shipments of food, timber, and daily necessities were halted. Boston fell into scarcity. Streets once alive with carts with shouts from the docks now fell silent. Sea winds blew through idle ships, their masts creaking like quiet laments. But that was only the beginning. Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act, stripping the colony of its autonomy. The local legislature was dissolved, its powers transferred to a royal governor. Town meetings, once the heart of community decision-making, were banned or strictly limited. People, once free to discuss taxes and roads, now found themselves silenced, forced to listen to orders from above. Next came the Administration of Justice Act, allowing any British official accused of a crime in the colonies to be tried back in England. To the people of Boston, this was nothing less than a shield for tyranny. Officials could oppress without fear. Locals gave it a bitter nickname, the Murder Act, because it seemed to let the powerful kill without consequence. Finally, the Quartering Act was renewed, tightening its grip. Colonists were now required to house and feed British troops when ordered. In Boston, this meant small wooden homes and cramped parlors could be handed over to unfamiliar soldiers. The sounds of boots on stone, the clink of weapons grew common at night. Families lay in bed, listening to the soldiers' voices outside, feeling the city slipping away from them. More troops arrived. Red-coated soldiers appeared on every street, in squares, outside taverns, in front of homes. Their reflections in shop windows made passers-by lower their voices. The whole city felt watched, tightened, as if caught in a slowly closing cage. How did Boston respond? At first, with fear. Families hoarded food, bolted doors, avoided conflict. But fear did not breed submission, it bred solidarity. Supplies began arriving from neighboring colonies, carried over treacherous inland routes. Wagons of flour, rice, and grain came from Connecticut, from Pennsylvania. Though the port was closed, the land became lifeblood. Helping Boston became a duty. If Boston could be punished, then no colony was safe. In churches, prayers grew longer. People asked God for strength to endure. They whispered of injustice, of liberty, of dignity. Candles burned longer through the night, not just for light, but to keep hope alive. The Boston Port Act brought hardship, but it also made Boston a symbol. News of the blockade spread. In Virginia, a day of fasting and prayer was declared in support. In New York, people raised money to help. In Philadelphia, merchants vowed to stop importing British goods. The fire sparked in one city began to leap from shore to shore. In Boston's wooden homes, families felt the change. Meals shrank, prices soared, The cries of hungry children became more frequent. But in the eyes of their parents, something hardened. They knew to live humbly was one thing, to live humiliated was another. The laws that Parliament had hoped would crush rebellion were instead pulling the colonies closer together. The intolerable acts, with all their cruel precision, had unknowingly sown the seeds of something greater. Every silent street in Boston, every home occupied by soldiers, every missing loaf of bread, it was all adding up, all building towards something. That silence was not surrender. It was the quiet before the storm. Boston was no longer just a city under blockade. By the summer of 1774, it had become a symbol, an image seared into the minds of people across the American colonies. Empty merchant docks, sealed harbors, families surviving on outside aid. This was no longer just Massachusetts' burden. In Virginia, in Pennsylvania, in the Carolinas, people began to say, if today it's Boston, tomorrow it could be us. And that was when something new began to emerge, a spirit of colonial unity. Before this, the 13 colonies were more different than alike. New England, with its small towns and merchant economy, the South, with sprawling plantations of tobacco, rice, and cotton. Pennsylvania and New York, a mix of cultures and religions, people identified as Virginians, as Carolinians, as citizens of Massachusetts, not yet as Americans. But the image of Boston under punishment sparked a shared question. What will we do if this happens to all of us? Meetings began to spread. In churches, taverns, and plain wooden halls, people gathered to talk. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, met in Philadelphia. It was the first Continental Congress, a gathering that had never happened before. For the first time, the colonies sent delegates not under orders from London, but of their own choosing. In Carpenter's Hall, men in long coats and powdered wigs debated for hours. They didn't speak as Virginians or New Yorkers, they spoke as we. From that meeting came several decisions. They drafted a petition to King George III, demanding the repeal of the harsh laws. But their response didn't end with words. They agreed on economic resistance, non-importation, and non-consumption of British goods. They encouraged people to spin their own cloth, to produce for themselves, and rely less on the mother country. Across the colonies, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty spread a rallying cry, liberty or death. In small homes, women sat weaving homespun fabric, a simple act turned political. At the markets, people refused to buy tea, sugar, or any goods from Britain. Children grew up hearing stories of Boston, of the night the tea was thrown into the sea. Anger had ceased to be just a feeling. It became culture. It became identity. When British soldiers marched Boston streets, it wasn't only Bostonian eyes watching, it was a whole continent. When British merchant ships floated offshore, unable to dock, the news reached Virginia, where plantation owners publicly voiced support. When the king rejected compromise and sent more troops, militia drills began in villages. Farmers with old muskets stood in lines, practicing under the guidance of veterans. They were called Minutemen, ready to fight within a minute's notice. All of colonial society became a boiling pot. On the surface it seemed calm, but the pressure kept rising. And in the spring of 1775, when the first gunshots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the flame had caught. Boston, once the target of punishment, had become the torch that lit a revolution. And what's striking is that Boston's resistance, the tea tossed into the sea, the endurance under blockade, was never wild or bloodthirsty. They didn't burn their own city, didn't massacre soldiers. Their actions were like a quiet declaration. We will not yield. And it was this silence, this patience, that reached people far beyond Massachusetts. When seen in a wider lens, the Boston Tea Party and everything that followed was not a unique moment in human history. It was part of a long current movement where ordinary people rose against economic oppression. Over a century later, in India, Mahatma Gandhi would lead the Salt March in 1930. The British, then ruling India, had imposed a monopoly on salt, an essential good, and taxed it heavily. Gandhi, with thousands by his side, walked over 300 kilometers to the sea, lifted a pinch of salt from the ocean, and declared defiance. It was a silent act, but it rang loud, just like Boston's tea spilling into the harbor. Both carried the same message: we do not consent. In Europe, centuries earlier, peasants had also risen against taxes. In France, uprisings sparked over salt and wine taxes, things that touched everyday life. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was born under the weight of poll taxes forced onto the poor. These rebellions didn't always win, but they left behind a lesson. When rulers strike at food, shelter, or basic dignity, people will not endure forever. Boston, then, is more than a place. It is a chapter in the long human story of how people seek to reclaim their right to shape their own fate. Whether it was a French peasant in the 14th century, an American colonist in the 18th, or an Indian under colonial rule. In the 20th, they are united in one truth: resistance is not just survival, it is the assertion of dignity. And in hindsight, the intolerable acts, those ruthless laws, did not force the colonies to submit. Instead, they helped the colonies discover who they were. From scattered towns, a community began to form. From outrage, they forged a language of liberty. And from the seeds planted in Boston, a nation slowly began to grow. As we close the chapter on Boston, on whispers that turned into gunfire and sparked a revolution, it feels like stepping out of a cramped room, thick with pipe smoke, voices raised in heated debate, and the lingering scent of tea spilled across the decks of a ship. The heat of the 18th century still lingers in the mind, like the aftertaste of a cup of tea that never had the chance to cool. But now let the mind drift further back, beyond the ocean, where crates of tea sank beneath the waves, beyond the tensioned harbors of New England waiting for the spark to ignite. We turn to a different land, a place so silent you can almost hear the wind tearing across the desert, the trickle of ancient rivers, and the echo of time itself. Before there was the United States, before England ruled the seas, long before the stone castles of medieval Europe, there stood a city in what is now Peru. Not Machu Picchu, not even the Inca, but something far older, Caral, believed to be one of the first civilizations of the Americas. A city that thrived alongside the pyramids of Egypt and the city-states of Sumer. If Boston is a story of protest and noise, then Caral is a story of silence. A civilization that left behind no signs of war, no fortresses or weapons, but instead colossal pyramids, wide ceremonial plazas, and a deep sense of order. Now, as we leave behind the clamor of politics and rebellion, we step into a world of sand and water, of harmony and wind, where the only music that remains is the soft, hollow tune of ancient bone flutes still whispering across the millennia. You can imagine it. No more sound of waves crashing against the hulls in Boston, no more chants echoing from overcrowded meetings, only a parched landscape where the wind howls across dunes and the sun scorches the earth. This is the Soup Valley, located on the northern coast of present-day Peru, about 200 kilometers from the capital city of Lima. A stretch of land that at first glance seems utterly inhospitable, unlikely to become the cradle of any civilization. To the west lies the Pacific Ocean, stretching endlessly, sometimes casting moist fog inland. To the east rise the Andes Mountains, towering like grey stone walls. In between, desert, where the sun burns during the day and the cold wind cuts the skin at night. And yet amidst that harshness one river flows, the Soup River, carrying fresh water from melting snow in the mountains, carving a thin green line where people once stopped and tried to build life. More than 5,000 years ago, humans found not just water here, but a promise that the land could be cultivated, seeds could take root, and a community could grow. What's remarkable is that Caral wasn't built right by the sea, where fish were more abundant, but deeper in the valley, over 20 kilometers from the Pacific. The people of Caral chose a middle ground where they could rely on inland agriculture while still trading with coastal fishermen. This wasn't a random choice, it was a strategic balance between scorching sand and ocean waves. During the day, desert sun made the sand hot enough to burn feet, and the air shimmered in the heat. The people of Caral built houses of stone and mud, thicker and sturdier than the fragile wattle and daub dwellings of medieval Europe. But at night, wind from the Andes swept down, bringing sudden cold that turned breath into white mist. This cold was unlike European winters. No thick snow, but a dry, biting chill that cracked lips and blistered skin. To survive, they relied on the Soup River, turning it into the lifeblood that sustained their world. The Soup Valley then must have looked quite different from today. Cotton fields stretched out, white against the sun. Cotton wasn't just used for weaving cloth, it was a bridge to the sea. They spun cotton into fishing nets, then traded those nets with coastal communities in exchange for dried fish and seafood. It was this trade, not direct proximity to the ocean, that helped Caral thrive in the desert. Their agriculture was diverse: potatoes, beans, chili peppers, and native tubers. More importantly, they mastered irrigation, digging canals to carry water from the river to their fields, keeping soil moist enough to plant. In a land where one long drought could wipe everything out, this was a life-saving technique. What stands out is that Caral rose without war. Archaeologists have found no evidence of fortresses, no weapons, no traces of battle. Unlike many civilizations where expansion and defense were central, Caral seems to have chosen a different path. They relied on trade, ritual, and collective cooperation to maintain order. The harsh but promising landscape of the Soup Valley taught them that only unity ensured survival. Archaeological findings at Caral reveal a collective lifestyle: circular plazas that could hold hundreds, stepped pyramids built of stone, and earth rising up to 20 meters tall, standing firm in the middle of the desert. Constructing such monuments required community collaboration, thousands of labor hours, shared effort, and a vision larger than any individual. One can imagine a sunset scene, the sun glowing red behind distant mountains, and groups of Caral people walking in lines, carrying stones and earth, singing or playing bone flutes to keep rhythm. Music echoing through the arid air, blending with the wind, a testament that even in the harshest places, people can create connection through labor and art. The birth of Caral then wasn't just about finding a river. It was about choosing between life and death, between isolation and trade, between barrenness and community. Every cotton plant grown, every dried fish bartered, every stone laid on the pyramid steps, these were all signs that a people had figured out how to turn a seemingly meaningless place into a center of life. Today, standing among Caral's remains grey stone foundations, open plazas, it's hard to feel the pulse that once beat here. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine a full moon night when the city gathered outdoors around great fires, the sound of hide drums beating, flutes crying out long, haunting notes. The desert, rather than a place of death, became a stage for a young but resilient civilization. And so this is the beginning of Caral, a quiet beginning, where people and nature reached a compromise, not through conquest, not through violence, but through patience and ingenuity. The desert's harshness and the Soup River's generosity together laid the foundations for one of the oldest civilizations in the Americas, its echo still with us today. If we go deeper into Caral after picturing the rare waters of the Soup River and the stretches of cotton fields, we begin to see what truly sets this place apart, its architecture. Not simple huts, not scattered makeshift farmlands, but massive structures made of stone and earth, so enduring that they have survived more than 5,000 years and still leave their marks today. In a desert where wind carries away sand by the day and earthquakes regularly shake the ground, the people of Caral built pyramids and plazas, a silent declaration that they were not merely surviving, but claiming a collective presence. Caral had no walls, no castles like medieval Europe, but it did have stepped pyramids, some rising up to 20 meters. From a distance, amid dunes and farmlands, these stacked stone terraces look like stairways to the sky, monumental and mysterious. Not built for burials like Egypt's pyramids, not built for defense like fortresses. These seem to have served as ceremonial centers and community gathering points. Each tier, layered with earth and stone, was broad enough to hold hundreds of people at once. At the base of the pyramids were sunken circular plazas, carved into the earth large enough to host an entire village. Even as wind filled the steps with drifting sand, the strong silhouettes of these structures still stood tall. What's remarkable is that Caral had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals like horses or oxen, and yet they moved thousands of tons of stone. Archaeologists discovered that the Caral people used a technique called shikra netted bags woven from cotton, filled with rocks and then stacked to build walls. These bags were easier to transport than loose stones and allowed the structures to flex during earthquakes. Instead of collapsing, the shikra absorbed the shock, dispersing the force, allowing the pyramids to endure. It's a stunning example of technical ingenuity, not from a powerful empire with armies, but from a quiet desert community. Caral's city planning also shows remarkable organization. The pyramids and plazas weren't placed randomly, they followed a shared axis, a clear sense of symmetry. Dirt roads connected different zones, separating residential areas from ritual ones. In the vast desert, the city appeared like a map, drawn in earth and stone-ordered, centered, deliberate. There were no written records, no stone steles of praise or proclamation, but the spatial layout spoke clearly. Caral was a society that thought ahead, beyond the concerns of daily survival. Imagine a night gathering in one of those sunken plazas. Hundreds of people sitting in a wide circle, tiered by height, firelight flickering across their faces. Smoke drifted into the desert air, mixing with the sounds of flutes and drums. The music resonated off the circular walls and echoed back a natural amplifier that turned space into sound. These plazas were not just architecture, they were instruments. They brought people together through ritual, through rhythm, through breath and beat. Interestingly, the people of Caral didn't build just one pyramid, but many, each likely with a specific purpose. Some of the larger ones had wide staircases where leaders might have stood, overlooking the valley. Others were connected to smaller neighborhoods, perhaps used for rituals of smaller groups. All were linked by footpaths like parts of a living organism, each structure a vital organ in service of a shared body. Another astonishing fact: Caral stood in an earthquake-prone region, yet most of its architecture still stands millennia later. While other civilizations fell to natural disasters, the people of Caral designed for resilience. The shikra bags were one answer, but so was their approach to foundations. Layering compacted earth and sand to create shock-absorbing bases. Their buildings, in essence, moved with the ground. Compared to modern standards, Caral may represent one of humanity's earliest earthquake-resistant architectural systems. Today, as modern visitors walk across Caral's dusty grounds, sand still drapes over stone steps, and silence reigns. But if you listen closely, you might imagine the beat of drums, the cries of voices, or the laughter of children echoing through the plazas. Each stone is a witness to what once was, a testament to the way humans can tame the desert through skill and solidarity. Caral left no writing, so everything we know comes from the earth itself. But sometimes the silence of ruin speaks louder than words. The rising steps and sunken plazas are a language of form, a message that this was a society that dreamed big and found a way to build those dreams into physical shape. While many contemporary communities remained small villages, Caral created a city, a ceremonial heart, where religion, music, and engineering flowed together. And so, in this place of wind and sand, Caral stands as a quiet monument that humans without metal, without wheels, could still build structures that outlast time. These step pyramids and circular plazas are more than buildings. They are memory, they are breath. They are the architectural soul of a civilization that believed deeply in the power of the collective. In our imagination of ancient civilizations, there are usually two opposing images. Either a community steeped in war, with weapons, fortresses, and soldiers, or a society of festivals, songs, and religion. Caral seems to belong firmly to the second. For centuries, no trace of warfare has been found here. No arrows, no copper weapons, no defensive walls. Instead, archaeology uncovers instruments made from bird bones, from shells, from clay drums, and plazas built for collective rituals. Together they paint a different picture, an ancient society whose strength lay not in the sword's edge, but in music, in ceremony, and in communal harmony. The music of Caral is remembered most clearly through flutes carved from the wing bones of pelicans. On the dry sands of the Seep Valley, archaeologists have gathered hollow fragments, carefully drilled with holes. When blown, they sing high, pure, like wind, but with rhythm. Imagine an evening when desert winds carry sand into the rocks, and from the plaza rise the sounds of flutes, echoing, repeating, as though calling the moon and stars, as though binding earth to sky. There were no written scores, yet the sound itself was the cord that tied the community, drawing all into a shared rhythm. Alongside the bone flutes, Caral also had trumpets fashioned from seashells. It is a striking detail. The city lies deep in the valley, many miles from the ocean, yet they carried the shells back, drilled holes, and transformed them into horns. The voice of the shell is unlike the flute, deep, resonant, like the sea calling across the desert. Together, flute and shell created a dialogue, one voice of the wind, the other of the waves. In the night, such sounds must have made people feel they stood at the very center of the universe, embraced by two forces of nature. These instruments were not for leisure alone. They were found in ritual settings, beside fire pits, near pyramid steps, buried in the plaza floors. It shows that music in Caral was woven tightly into religion and community. The Caral did not build temples for a god of war. They built plazas where the village could gather, with flutes, with drums, with horns. Perhaps for them, music was the prayer, the way to keep balance between people and land, between sky and river. In some excavations, archaeologists uncovered sunken circular courts with traces of ash and charcoal inside. Perhaps these were the places where fire was lit for the ceremonies. Picture it, flames flickering, the plaza sloping down like a vast bowl, its steps filled with people. Clay drums setting the beat, bone flutes piercing the air, shell horns rolling deep. The entire community joining in one voice. No fortress walls to divide them. No soldiers at the gates. Only drumbeats, firelight, and hundreds of breaths rising as one. The strange thing is that Caral endured for millennia without any signs of war. No skeletons with battle wounds, no ramparts, no arsenals. Instead, there were instruments in abundance, ritual structures, and fields of cultivation. It makes Caral one of the rare examples of a peaceful society in the ancient world. They built pyramids not as fortresses, but as festival centers. They carved flutes, not weapons, and somehow they kept their stability for generations. Music may have been the tool of that stability. When the community gathered, playing flutes, beating drums, joining in rituals, each person felt themselves part of a greater whole. This bond eased conflict, replacing it with collective spirit. In many civilizations, rituals were tied to blood sacrifice, to war and violence. But Caral seems different. Their ceremonies joined sound, firelight, and the resonance of hundreds of bodies moving together. One detail lingers. Among the instruments found were flutes, drilled so evenly that they produced distinct scales. This shows they were not simply making random noise, but had a sense of pitch, of melody. Perhaps those melodies were repeated across generations, becoming an invisible language, a memory passed from one age to another. When the same notes were played, the community entered the current of collective memory, a shared remembrance without writing. Caral then stands as proof that a society could be built not on violence, but on rhythm and ritual. Its sunken plazas were not just architecture, they were the spaces where music and belief became one. Standing among the ruins today, with wind moving through the Soup Valley and sand drifting over the steps, one can almost hear it again. The flutes soaring, the drums echoing from the earth, the shells sounding deep, and hundreds of voices woven together. In this sense, music was Caral's weapon, not to kill but to preserve peace. A soft weapon that tied the community close, dissolving conflict into rhythm and song. This is what makes Caral stand out in history, an ancient civilization whose strength lay not in armies, but in resonance. While other civilizations chose to define themselves through war, Caral walked another path. And it is this difference that makes Caral a precious legacy, a reminder that there are roads beyond violence. The bone flutes, the shell horns, the clay drums, silent now for thousands of years, still tell the story of a society that once chose music over swords, peace over war. In the arid valley of Soup, where Caral once stood, the greatest question was not how to raise pyramids, but how to secure food. Behind the grand constructions, behind the musical rituals, the society of Caral could survive only on one foundation: agriculture and the watching of the heavens. It was these two elements, quiet, almost hidden, that formed the spine of their civilization. If you stand in the valley today, the sand stretches dry toward the horizon. It is hard to believe that more than 4,000 years ago, this was once farmland, green and alive. The secret lay in the small rivers flowing down from the Andes. There was not much water, but the people of Caral learned to guide it into canals, turning it into a system of irrigation. The channels were not deep, not vast like those of Egypt, but they were enough to nourish barley, maize, squash, beans, and they did not rely on a single crop. They planted variety, creating balance between staple grains and smaller vegetables. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these narrow canals running alongside terraces. When the water flowed down, the roots of the plants held the sandy soil in place. Each harvest season, the community gathered to dredge the canals, an act that was at once labor and ritual. The sound of shovels, the trickle of water, the smell of wet earth, all spoke of a life bound to the land. For Caral, the canal was not only a tool, it was a thread between people and nature. Alongside the water, they carried guano, seabird droppings, brought inland from the coast to serve as fertilizer. This reveals a link between the valley and the sea, and it was one way Caral kept the land fertile. In a dry climate, soil loses its strength quickly, but guano, rich in nitrogen, gave crops a deeper green. Some even suggest that the exchange of guano was central to Caral's economy. Yet agriculture was not only earth and water, it was also sky. The Caral people seem to have watched the stars to predict their seasons. They had no books, no clocks. What they had was a wide night sky, untouched by artificial light. There, they followed the appearance and fading of constellations, the changes of the moon, the rise and fall of the sun. Stone platforms and standing pillars found across Caral may once have been their instruments of astronomy. When the sun rose or set at a certain point, it signaled the time for sowing or for harvest. It recalls other civilizations, Egypt watching the Nile and the star Sirius, the Maya with their intricate calendars, and Caral with nothing but the horizon of their valley. Picture a morning when the sun lifts itself over the Andes. The first light falls straight across the steps of a plaza. The Caral must have stood there, seen it, remembered. This is when the new season begins. They did not need writing. They could pass it on by standing together, watching the light touch stone. Astronomy was not only for crops but for faith. For Caral, the planting could not be separated from the sacred. At sowing, they played flutes, beat drums, prayed. At harvest, they gathered again in plazas, shared their food, offered gifts to earth and sky. The rhythm of the seasons became the rhythm of spirit. Some researchers believe they even read the signs of El Niño, the change of ocean currents that brought rain or drought. By watching both sea and stars, they could prepare, shift their crops, store food. This shows Caral was not living on luck alone, but on an early science, one tied to climate and sky. And unlike many others, Caral's agriculture did not march with war. They expanded through trade, exchanging cotton, dried fish, vegetables with neighboring communities instead of conquest. Cotton was vital, not for food, but for weaving fishing nets. It was agriculture and astronomy together that made Caral a center of exchange, a quiet source of influence across the region. If you listen closely, you might imagine the water running through canals, the wind brushing the fields, the tread of feet on soft soil. These were the sounds of Caral's life, not swords, not war cries. Their music came from earth and sky, their survival from the art of farming and the patience of watching. Caral, then, is a reminder that a society can rise not through violence, but through harmony with nature, through adjusting life to its rhythms. Simple canals, stone platforms aligned with the sun. Each shows the wisdom of a people woven into the land. And it was by this that they endured thousands of years in a place that seems, even now, unkind. Today, when we stand among their ruins and watch the Andes fade into the mist, we may imagine how they once lifted their eyes to the stars, marking the path of Orion, of the moon, of the sun. Each light became a signal: sow, irrigate, wait, harvest. An entire civilization built upon that rhythm, the rhythm of earth and sky, of agriculture and astronomy. If you walk along the Soup Valley today and see the great mounds of earth rising like mute hills, it is hard to imagine that this place was once the center of a vibrant civilization. Caral, the oldest city in the Americas, after thousands of years of flourishing, also disappeared, leaving behind only a quiet question. Why? There are no traces of war, no walls stained with blood, no fortresses brought down by sword and spear. Instead, Caral slipped quietly from the stage of history. One common theory is that the climate changed. The river that had once fed the fields grew shallow. Severe El Niño events may have destroyed crops, brought drought that lingered. A society built upon agriculture, however clever, could hardly resist when nature itself grew harsh. Another theory is of exhaustion, that the land used too long grew poor. When the fields could no longer sustain a growing population, the Caral were forced to leave, to search for other valleys. There was no sudden collapse, no flames or ruin, only a slow departure, family by family, community by community, until Caral was nothing but lonely terraces, silent in the wind. Strangely, after Caral vanished, it seemed to be forgotten entirely. For thousands of years its earthen pyramids lay hidden under sand. Local people thought them nothing more than natural hills. It was not until the 20th century that the world was awakened to its presence. And the greatest credit belongs to a Peruvian archaeologist, Ruth Shady. In 1994, Shady and her team began excavating Caral. At first, few believed it would be anything remarkable. But as the layers of soil were peeled away, as foundations, terraces and plazas emerged, the world was astonished. Caral was not merely an old site, it was proof that in the Americas, civilization had blossomed very early, contemporary with Sumer, Egypt, and ancient China. The image of Ruth Shady standing on one of Caral's terraces, her coat lifted by the wind, became its own kind of symbol. She fought for years to protect and study the site in the face of constant struggle for funding. Thanks to her, Caral was recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 2009. From forgotten dust, Caral became a vital piece in the map of human history. What makes Caral special is the way it reminds us that civilization has no single cradle. For long, people believed that Mesopotamia, or Egypt along the Nile, or China on the Yellow River, were the first centers. But Caral proves that on a distant continent, untouched by the Old World, a civilization had risen of its own accord, born, grown, and shone brightly. Sumer gave writing, Egypt built pyramids, China raised rice agriculture. Caral had its earthen pyramids, its bone flutes, its society without war. Each civilization a different answer to the same question: how can people live together, create order, extend their existence? More remarkable still, Caral knew nothing of the wheel or iron or writing, yet they built massive works, organized a vast society. It forces us to rethink progress is not measured only by technology but by the ability of human beings to bind themselves together. When we set Caral beside Sumer, Egypt or China, we see a likeness. All drew life from agriculture, from watching nature. But Caral left little trace of war. Perhaps it fell to climate, not to the hand of man against man. That too is a legacy. History is not only fire and blood, but also quiet endurance, in rhythm with earth and sky. Today, visitors to Caral can climb its stone steps, stand in its ancient plaza, and listen to the wind sweeping through the desert. No more sound of bone flutes, no more ritual drums. But in the silence, the past echoes. The voice of a civilization that once lived, once breathed, once dreamed, then vanished, leaving us with questions more than answers. Caral, in this way, feels like an ancient dream rediscovered. It reminds us that human history does not follow a single line, but resembles a woven cloth, many threads crossing side by side. And among the familiar strands, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Caral appears as its own distinct color, a whisper from the far side of the ocean. Perhaps in looking at Caral, we learn that every civilization, great or small, is fragile before time. But their legacy does not live only in stone. It lives in what they awaken in our imagination. And Caral, with its solemn silence, reminds us that humankind has many ways to endure, many ways to build a world, not all of them needing violence. And so the stories fade. The fire in the peasant's hut goes out. Anne Boleyn steps into history's shadow. The harbour in Boston grows quiet again, and Caral's pyramid stands silent in the desert night. What remains is not just dates or names, but a soft reminder that history is, at its heart, human, fragile, ordinary, and sometimes strangely comforting when told in the dark. This was another long journey with the Sleepy Historian here on Historian Sleepy 365. If these quiet tales of boring history for sleep help you drift off, you can always return. There will be more stories waiting. For now, let the past grow still, and let sleep take over. Good night.